The Haunting Hour. What would you do if your reflection started moving on its own? For Sarah Chen, this wasn't just a nightmare. It was the beginning of a terrifying reality that unfolded during her investigation of an ancient ritual. But I should warn you, what you're about to hear isn't just another ghost story. This is a tale about breaking the barriers between our world and something far more sinister. Sarah never believed in the supernatural until she inherited her grandmother's Victorian mansion in New England. Among the dusty artifacts in the attic, she discovered an ornate silver mirror and a leather-bound journal dated 1892. The journal belonged to her great-great-grandfather, a professor of occult studies at Miskatonic University. The professor's final entry described a ritual called the Midnight Reflection, a ceremony that supposedly allowed communication with entities from beyond our dimension. The requirements seemed simple: an antique mirror, 3 black candles, and a specific incantation to be performed at exactly midnight during a new moon. Sarah, a skeptical academic herself, saw an opportunity for her doctoral thesis in paranormal psychology. She dismissed the warnings scrawled in red ink on the journal's final pages. Never perform this ritual. The entity must remain bound. On the night of the new moon, Sarah arranged everything precisely as described. The antique mirror stood on her grandmother's mahogany dresser, 3 black candles forming a triangle around it. At precisely midnight, she began reciting the Latin phrases from the journal. At first, nothing happened. Then the candle flames turned an unnatural shade of blue. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs of vapor. But what happened next defied all logic. Her reflection began moving independently. Her mirror image smiled at her, though Sarah herself remained frozen in horror. The reflection's eyes turned completely black, and it pressed its hands against the glass as if trying to break through. The mirror's surface rippled like liquid mercury. Panic-stricken, Sarah tried to throw a sheet over the mirror, but her reflection caught her gaze. In that moment, she felt something push against her consciousness, ancient, malevolent, and hungry. The entity had been waiting for centuries, trapped behind countless reflective surfaces, and now it had found its way out. The mirror cracked with a sound like breaking ice. Sarah watched in terror as her reflection's hands pushed through the glass, reaching into our world. They weren't her hands anymore. They were elongated, with too many joints, the skin a mottled grey. Sarah ran from the room, but every reflective surface in the house, windows, television screens, even her phone, showed the entity's face instead of her reflection. It was spreading, using the network of reflective surfaces to manifest itself in our world, in desperate need of help. Sarah called the only person who might understand, Dr. Eleanor Wright, her thesis advisor who specialized in occult history. Dr. Wright arrived within the hour, armed with knowledge from similar cases throughout history. She explained that the entity was a Speculum Demon, an ancient being that existed in the space behind reflections. Together, they had to perform a binding ritual before sunrise, or the demon would permanently enter our world. As they worked to contain the entity, Sarah realized why her great-great-grandfather had hidden the mirror away. He hadn't discovered a communication ritual. He had found a prison, and she had just released its inmate. As the first rays of dawn broke through the windows, Sarah and Dr. Wright completed the binding ritual. The demon fought violently, shattering every reflective surface in the house. But in the end, they managed to trap it once again in the original mirror, which they sealed in a lead-lined box and buried deep in the woods. But Sarah never fully recovered from that night. Even now, years later, she keeps all mirrors covered in her home, because sometimes, just sometimes, when she catches a glimpse of her reflection, it smiles back at her with eyes that aren't quite human. The next time you look in a mirror at midnight, remember Sarah's story. And if your reflection moves just a fraction of a second too late, well, maybe it's not your reflection at all. In 2018, a family in rural Massachusetts contacted the Catholic Church about strange sounds coming from their basement. When investigators arrived, they found something that challenged everything they knew about demonic possession. But the most terrifying part? The entity wasn't trying to get out, it was inviting them in. The Henderson family purchased their colonial-style home at a remarkably low price, which should have been their first warning. The previous owners had lived there for just 3 months before abandoning the property, leaving behind most of their belongings. James Henderson, a structural engineer, initially dismissed his wife Rebecca's concerns about the strange scratching sounds emanating from their basement. Their daughter Emma's claims of hearing someone whispering her name through the heating vents were attributed to an overactive imagination. But then, the dream started. Each family member reported the same dream, standing at the basement door at exactly 3:33 a.m., while something on the other side whispered promises of wealth, success, and power, if only they would perform a simple ritual to open the door properly. Rebecca, researching the house's history, discovered disturbing patterns. Every family that had lived there since 1943 had either abandoned the property or met with tragic accidents. The only exception was the Whitaker family, who lived there for 27 years but kept the basement door sealed with crosses and refused to enter it. The breaking point came when Emma started sleepwalking. They found her 3 nights in a row, standing at the basement door with a piece of chalk, drawing partial symbols on the floor. The symbols matched no known language, but caused severe headaches in anyone who looked at them for too long. Father Michael Torres, an experienced exorcist, arrived with a team of investigators. Their equipment recorded temperature drops of 40 degrees near the basement door, and audio recordings captured voices speaking in what linguistics experts later identified as ancient Aramaic, spoken backwards. During their investigation, they discovered that the house had been built over the remains of a meeting house belonging to a cult called the Order of the Eternal Doorway. In 1853, all 13 cult members had vanished without a trace. Their leader's journal, found in the town archives, described a ritual to open a gateway for an entity they called the Tenant. The team's presence seemed to agitate whatever dwelled in the basement. The scratching became louder and the dreams more vivid. EMF readings went off the charts, and cameras captured dark masses moving through the basement windows. But most disturbing were the voices, now clear enough to understand. Let us show you, let us teach you, let us in. Father Torres recognized the signs of an ancient type of demon, one that didn't forcefully possess its victims but rather tempted them into willing participation. The more they investigated, the stronger it became, feeding off their curiosity and fear. The situation reached its peak when Emma went missing for 3 hours. They found her in the basement, unharmed, but changed. She spoke of beautiful things the tenant had shown her and insisted they should all join the dance. Father Torres knew they had to act immediately. The team performed an ancient banishing ritual, not to expel the entity. It was too deeply rooted for that, but to seal it away permanently. As they completed the ritual, the entire house shook. The basement door burst open, revealing not a room, but an endless void filled with shifting geometric patterns and distant, impossible colors. The ceiling worked, but at a cost. Father Torres was never quite the same afterward, and 3 members of his team left the church entirely. The Hendersons moved out the next day, but the worst revelation came 2 weeks later. Similar basements, with similar tenants, had been discovered in 7 other locations across New England. The Henderson house still stands empty today. The basement door remains sealed with blessed chains, but local teenagers swear they can sometimes hear music drifting up from below. Beautiful, impossible music that makes them want to dance. And if you listen carefully on quiet nights, you might hear the tenant still whispering its promises through the neighborhood's heating vents, waiting for someone curious enough to perform the ritual and open the door properly. In December 2019, a remote radio station in Colorado went silent for 76 hours. When authorities finally reached the station through 8 feet of snow, they found equipment running, but no staff present. The official report cited an avalanche, but the recovered audio tapes tell a different story, one that the government tried to keep quiet. KDRK-FM, known locally as The Peak, broadcast from Mount Elbert at 14,000 feet elevation. The station's skeleton crew of 3 maintained communication with civilization for the small mining communities scattered through the Rockies. David Martinez, the senior technician, had worked there for 15 years without incident until the night everything changed. The trouble began when they started receiving interference on their emergency frequency, a channel reserved for distress signals. At first it was just static, but then came the voice. Margaret Chen, the night shift operator, described it in her final log entry as speaking in multiple tones simultaneously, like a choir of the damned. The voice requested the same thing repeatedly: play my song at midnight. When they ignored it, the temperature inside the station dropped so severely that pipes burst and ice formed on the internal walls. The backup generators activated without explanation, and all their phones died simultaneously. Station manager Tom Brooks contacted the National Weather Service, but their call was cut short when the voice returned. This time through every piece of equipment in the station, including their personal devices. It began reciting names, their families' names, and names of people who had died in the mountains over the past century. Margaret discovered that their signal was broadcasting far beyond its normal range. They received calls from stations in New Mexico, Utah, and even California, all reporting the same interference. More disturbing were the calls from listeners who claimed the broadcast was telling them to prepare for the gathering. Through research on the station's ancient computers, David found records of a similar incident in 1947. A religious cult called the Congregation of Eternal Night had attempted a mass ritual on Mount Elbert, believing the mountain's height would bring them closer to what they called the Great Frequency, an entity they claimed existed in the space between radio waves. Tom thought it was all nonsense until he saw the shadow. It moved across the station walls like smoke, but seemed to absorb light rather than block it. Equipment began malfunctioning in sequence, each device playing fragments of an impossible song, notes that couldn't exist in human music. Margaret's last recording described symbols appearing in the frost on the windows, symbols that matched those used by the 1947 cult. The static between radio frequencies began forming patterns, and listeners reported hearing their dead relatives speaking through their radios. At 11:57 p.m., David made his final transmission. He described the shadow taking form, a shape that hurt to look at, constructed of angles that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. The entity was using their broadcast equipment to amplify its frequency, creating a door between dimensions. The rescue team found the station intact, but empty. The only clue was a single message carved into the main console. "We hear the song now. We understand the frequency. We are becoming the signal." The government shut down the station, but they couldn't shut down what had already been broadcast. In the months that followed, people across the American Southwest reported strange dreams of radio static and distant music. Ham radio operators began picking up fragments of broadcasts that matched no known station broadcasts that contained the voices of the missing staff, endlessly repeating, "The frequency is freedom, the signal is salvation. Join us in the spaces between stations." To this day, late-night drivers through the Rockies sometimes catch mysterious broadcasts on their car radios. If you hear multiple voices speaking in harmony, or music that makes your skin crawl, change the station immediately. But be warned, some say once you've heard the frequency, part of you always remains tuned to its signal, waiting for the next broadcast. In 2017, the FBI investigated the disappearance of 13 college students from a small town in northern Maine. What they uncovered in the forests of Ravenwood would haunt the investigators for the rest of their lives. This isn't just another story of a satanic panic. This is the documented case of what happened when ambitious researchers accidentally summoned something ancient and malevolent into our world. Professor Sarah Blackwood led a religious studies research group at Ravenwood University, focusing on early American cult practices. Her team discovered references to a pre-colonial structure deep in the Maine forest, a church that predated the earliest European settlements. According to Native American accounts, even their ancestors avoided the area, calling it the place where shadows walk. The research group's initial excavation revealed foundations made of black stone that matched no known geological formation in North America. Ground-penetrating radar showed a vast network of chambers beneath the ruins, but most disturbing were the radiation readings. The site emitted electromagnetic frequencies that made their equipment malfunction. Local historian James Cooper provided the team with documents from 1692, a time when the infamous witch trials were happening in nearby Salem. These papers described a splinter group that had found the true church in the woods, where they claimed to communicate with an entity they called the Dark Shepherd. The team's troubles began when they cleared the entrance to the underground chambers. They found walls covered in symbols that combined elements of Native American pictographs, early Christian iconography, and something older mathematical sequences that modern computers identified as expressing impossible geometries. Graduate student Michael Chen was the first to notice the changes. His research notes became increasingly erratic, describing dreams of a congregation of shadows that whispered mathematical formulas for folding space around the soul. 3 other students reported similar dreams, along with nosebleeds and migraines whenever they tried to sketch the symbols. During their final expedition, the team discovered a central chamber 200 feet below ground. The room was a perfect sphere, carved from the same black stone, with a pedestal at its center, holding an object described in Chen's final notes as a book bound in material that feels like liquid darkness. Local police received a 911 call from the site at 3:33 a.m. on October 31st. The recording captured only static and what audio experts later identified as multiple voices speaking mathematical equations in ancient languages simultaneously. When authorities arrived, they found the entrance to the chambers sealed by molten rock and no trace of the 13 team members. FBI Special Agent Diana Martinez led the investigation, documenting a series of disturbing findings. All electronic devices within a mile of the site played the same video when powered on footage of the missing team members reciting mathematical formulas while their shadows moved independently. Local residents reported seeing the missing students walking through walls and emerging from mirrors, always heading toward the sealed chamber entrance. Martinez's team discovered Professor Blackwood's final video log. She had decoded the symbols and realized too late what they had found. And the church wasn't built by early settlers or Native Americans. It had been constructed as a prison to contain something that had existed before human civilization. The mathematical formulas weren't meant to be solved. They were locks holding that entity in place. The investigation took a darker turn when Agent Martinez's team began disappearing. They found Agent Rogers in his hotel room, having covered every surface with the same mathematical symbols, his eyes completely black. His final report contained a single sentence. The Dark Shepherd doesn't want worship. It wants to teach us how to break the laws that hold reality together. The FBI officially closed the case after losing 4 agents. They sealed the area under the guise of environmental contamination, but satellite imagery shows the black stone spreading beneath the ground like veins. Local residents report that, on certain nights, they can hear singing from the forest hymns in languages that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. The case remains classified, but one detail haunts those who know the truth. Every year on October 31st, exactly 13 shadows appear around the sealed entrance, performing elaborate mathematical movements in perfect synchronization. And each year, the formulas they trace in the air come closer to completion, a solution to an equation that was never meant to be solved.